What is up, people? Today we're taking a look at the Mega Man games on Game Boy, that is, original Game Boy in color, which consists of 8 games total. Just to be clear, we're not looking at the GBA games, which would add 16 more games. What the? Mega Man was one of the greatest and most consistent game series on the NES, and the same can absolutely be said about the Game Boy Mega Mans. I actually don't think there's many game series that even come close. Yeah, Mario Land and DK are often very good, but they still have far fewer games and, at least in my opinion, don't necessarily eclipse the Mega Man games in quality. I actually like all of the games in this video and would recommend any of them, with the exception of one which we'll get into, but I can guarantee there's probably a 0% chance you'd ever play it anyways. So starting off, we have Mega Man Dr. Wily's Revenge, aka Rockman World, which was the first game in the series to be released on the Game Boy and is developed by Minakuchi Engineering, who also developed the legendary 16-bit titles Mega Man The Wily Wars and Mega Man X3. They developed all but one of the Rockman World games, which we'll get into a bit later. First thing I'll point out about this game is how big Mega Man and the enemy sprites are relative to the screen size. I guess it's not super out of the ordinary since Mega Man 7 is pretty similar when it comes to this. However, the metrics of this game are quite a bit different compared to NES. Mega Man's jump height and distance on Game Boy has been greatly reduced, which will definitely feel weird for first-time players, and I think Mega Man feeling so different to control is one of the main reasons why even Mega Man fans don't generally seem to be that fond of the Game Boy titles. But the levels are nicely designed around these differences, so all it takes is some getting used to. Of course, all of these games play quite a bit slower than those found on NES, but really that goes for NES series that makes its way onto Game Boy. I mean, have you seen this brick? At least the slower speed is not even 10% as dreadful to play as something like Castlevania The Adventure. I shudder even thinking about that game. Now, I don't know what the deal is, but everyone seems to think this is one of the hardest games of all time for some reason. The game is certainly at its hardest when you have yet to defeat a Robot Master, since I find their items are very useful to deal with even just the regular enemies, and you'll feel quite underpowered with just a Mega Buster. You're best going off with Cutman first, kind of like the NES game, although in this game it's an even wiser choice. The levels do feel a tad bit more evil than Mega Man on NES, seeing as they've introduced these fans, something that didn't even exist in Mega Man until the third game. Yet they've put it here in a game that features mostly elements from Mega Man 1 and 2. An interesting decision to be sure, since I'm fairly sure no one praised these things. But you know what, I actually almost like this game more than Mega Man on NES. The difficulty level for me is near perfect. I'll admit the first Mega Man feels a bit too short and easy to me these days. I mean, really just outside the Yellow Devil fight without pausing. It's kind of a breeze. I even like the soundtrack more, although I do think Mega Man 1 is the weakest soundtrack of the NES games. Dr. Wily Fortress 1 from Mega Man 1 was my favorite track in that game, and this game features an even better first Wily theme, which is what I've been playing in the background the whole time since it's a banger. I also like the second Wily theme more in this game than the second Wily theme on NES. These Wily tunes are probably so great because they're not trying to imitate any music on the NES, since when they do that, it kinda just sounds all weird. I also think the level designs are overall better, just a bit more evil, but you won't find anything as bad as this in this game. Featuring elements from more Mega Man games definitely adds more variety here. You'll also have many more powers at your disposal due to there being 8 Robot Masters instead of 6. Despite thinking this Game Boy game is better designed, I still prefer the NES Mega Man, and that's simply because it plays a whole lot faster and smoother due to being on the NES, and not this funny little device. I also just really like the magnet beam. This shield thing, not nearly as cool. To me, this is potentially the closest one of the Game Boy games got to surpassing its NES counterpart, though there is another worth mentioning in this video, but I'm not really sure that one counts. Rockman World 2, aka Mega Man II. First thing I like to do is put a disclaimer because this game does not actually run like this. My footage is lacking some frames to say the least, but it's what I got. Anyways, this game is a bit of a guilty pleasure for me. The design of this one can feel pretty lackluster, but I no doubt enjoy playing this game. Could it be that I'm just a slut for Mega Man? Probably. This is the only of the Rockman World games to not be developed by Minakuchi Engineering. There's conflicting information on which studio it was. Seriously, the Japanese Wikipedia says it's Japan System House, aka Biox, while the English Wikipedia says Thinking Rabbit, but I'm gonna assume it's mostly Biox with some collaboration from people of other studios, since most sources do suggest that it's Biox. I would actually consider Biox one of the best and most underrated developers on Game Boy, since I've liked everything I've played by them, which is all of their games that don't involve burgers. Samurai Kid and Daiku no Ginsan Kachikachi no Tankachi Gakachi are very solid 2D action platform puzzle games, and Firebird is another guilty pleasure game of mine that I may or may not have the speedrun world record in, which is pretty impressive when you consider that probably at least 5 other people have played the game.
World Record Headquarters can I help you?
But I think my favorite Biox game is actually this one. Probably the biggest flaw of Mega Man 2 for me is just how easy the game is, and I have a feeling that the game is this way due to the complaints of the first game being too hard. I finished the game with max lives and max E-tanks without even trying to. They just give you so many of both. E-tanks I didn't even find myself using since my life rarely got low enough to where it would be necessary. And because of how easy it is, this game ended up being the shortest classic Mega Man game, even though I've only played through it twice. The only other one that was actually shorter for me was Mega Man Game Gear on normal, although hard mode was quite a different story. I just went and checked, and actually Mega Man DOS was also shorter on the first playthrough, and there will never be a second playthrough, to say the least. As for my favorite things about this game, well, I appreciate that they've added the slide, which is something I wish was in Mega Man 2 on NES. Other than that, I really like the music. It was done by Kenji Yamazaki, who seemed to forget that he did music for almost every game he's worked on, and he just thought it was funny that he was being paid to compose music for games. He pretty much just did this part-time while still being in school. I honestly think Rockman World 2 would have gone down as one of the most legendary Game Boy soundtracks had it not been butchered by Hiroto Nakamura's high-pitched arrangements. I'm pretty sure Yamazaki simply wrote the music, which he was clearly very good at. He might even be one of my favorite game composers, while programmers would have to actually put his music in the games, which doesn't always get executed all that well. And in this case, it's probably because Biox released Mega Man 2 and Firebird on the same day, December 20th, 1991 for the holiday season. These games are both composed by Yamazaki and arranged by Nakamura, and considering Sound of Music tends to be the final thing that gets put into games, it's pretty safe to say that they simply didn't have time. While I don't hate the high-pitched arrangements, and still overall enjoy the music, it clearly could have been so much better, and I'm not the only one to notice this, as there seems to be countless remakes and remixes of this soundtrack out there, and I'd certainly recommend giving them a listen. I've listened to quite a few, but there's still so much more out there. Overall, I think people were too harsh on Rockman World 2. I wish the game was more challenging and the music was improved. But in the grand scheme of the Game Boy library, this is a very solid game. Maybe not one of the absolute best, but very solid. I mean, there are a lot of beloved Game Boy games that are short and easy. Actually, it's not even my least favorite of the Rockman World games. Minakuchi Engineering would return to develop Mega Man 3 or Rockman World 3 since apparently Inafune really hated Biox's work on Mega Man 2 and considered it to be a total nightmare. I can't say that it was the wrong choice since Mega Man 3 on Game Boy is really good. Better than the first two, and it's my second favorite of the World games overall. I feel that the game has the most balanced difficulty of all the titles. Mega Man Dr. Wily's Revenge, like I said, is the hardest in the beginning, but it gets easier, although the difficulty does pick back up near the end. Mega Man 2 is too dang easy the entire time, while Mega Man 3's difficulty is pretty consistent throughout. I'd probably put it right in the middle overall for difficulty, which for me looks like this, although for whatever reason most consider this to be the hardest of them all, and I'm not entirely sure why. There's just some slightly evil level design present in this game, but really all it requires is a bit more patience than usual, compared to the sections on its NES counterparts. Didn't really feel like the deaths themselves were all that cheap, unlike the next game. Speaking of which, this is the first of the World games that really does feel like the NES games. Sure, the game is still slower and Mega Man's jumping is reduced, but the music is pretty dang close. Just compare this soundtrack to the first game's attempt at replicating the NES music, although I must say I think I prefer when there's entirely original music for every stage, and not just the Wily stages. So I think I prefer what was attempted in Rockman World 2 where every track is original, even if it wasn't executed as well as it could have been. The graphics can sometimes feel one-to-one to the NES games, which is really impressive when you remember that this game was not actually developed by Capcom, who became really good at creating Game Boy conversions with their Disney games. But this game was instead outsourced. It feels like this is when Minakuchi Engineering really understood the Game Boy hardware. I mean, I even prefer how this game looks compared to the NES games sometimes. Like Snake Man Stage's moving background here, which is not nearly as dull to look at as the NES game. But that's just talking about the graphics. I'm not sure if it was worth replicating to this level since this game has a lot of slowdown. So despite my praise and thinking this game looks good, sounds good, and is well designed, there's no doubt I'd much rather play the NES games due to how slow this ends up being. It feels like they may have sacrificed playability for visuals here, and I get the feeling if they went for simpler graphics like the previous games, which don't have quite as bad slowdown, it would have fixed my biggest problem with the game. That being said, it's still definitely my favorite game we've looked at so far, and my favorite of the Rockman World games that tried to imitate the NES games. And now time for what is my least favorite game we've looked at. Well, actually, this is my least favorite Mega Man game, period. Which is saying a lot since there are a lot of official Mega Man games, which means there are plenty of bad Mega Man games. So quite a feat that this game managed to accomplish, and not one that I was really expecting, to be honest. Although I should have, since there is no Mega Man gameplay to be found here. It's merely Monopoly. Well, actually more like Itadaki Street or Fortune Street. That's right, Mega Man did it a decade before Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy, or Mario. Although this is not an official game in that series, and as for why Capcom even decided to make this game 10 years after the Famicom released, truly baffling. Who does this game even appeal to? I mean, they could have made some cool spin-offs with Rockman, and they certainly did later down the line, but here they just went with Monopoly. No one asked for this ever. This doesn't appeal to Mega Man fans, and it doesn't appeal to Monopoly fans. It's the only game in this video I don't like and will tell you to stay away from, although I can guarantee you were already going to stay away from it since you probably didn't even know this exists. As this Game Boy game, while complete, never officially released and only recently surfaced in 2020. It's basically a one-to-one port of the NES game, so by far the most accurate game in this video when compared to the console counterpart, since it really is the same exact thing. I mentioned earlier that there's another game worth mentioning as a game that almost surpassed their console counterpart, and just to be clear, I wasn't referring to this game. But this game really is the exact same quality as the NES game, although I guess I forgot to mention there may be a language barrier for you since it's not in English. Although there exists a Famicom English patch, but again, you will probably regret playing this in any capacity. There really is no fun to be found. And I'm pretty sure I'm the only person on Earth to have actually played all the way to the ending of this game, since I can't find any other footage of it. Although they didn't include the staff in this version's ending, probably because the game never actually released. To get to the ending, I think you need to gain control of over 70% of the board on the map Megalopolis in Battle Royale mode, which is really easy to do since at any point you can take control of the computer characters yourself and have them do poorly on purpose, and then you can just switch them back to a computer when they basically lost all hope of winning, as soon as you get enough of a lead. So basically losing in this game is a choice. It just takes a long time to actually get to the ending. The single game I played took 6 hours, which I guess is a pretty normal amount of time, but that was mostly because I was very distracted and bored. I guess the intention was that you could play with up to 4 other players by passing around the Game Boy, since there is no link cable compatibility and who the heck is going to want to do that? The Famicom version is the same deal as you have to pass around one controller, but with Game Boy it's even more awkward. I would imagine this Game Boy version never released because the Famicom version flopped so hard, and they realized this is not a game anybody wanted, ever. But really this might be the most baffling official Mega Man game. Even the music is forgettable, which is a crime for the franchise, and yet the music is still probably the best aspect of this game. Now here we have Rockman World 4. Everyone seems to think either the first or third games of the Rockman World series are the hardest, but for me it was easily the fourth game that took me the longest to clear. I honestly think this title just contains the most BS deaths of all the games. Stuff you're just not going to see coming the first time through and some evil jumps. It's a step above the other games when it comes to that, and you didn't even hear me mention BS deaths when I talked about the other games, since I feel that's a criticism of the Mega Man series that gets thrown around too much that I don't really find to be all that accurate. But here, I gotta admit, it has them. This game feels a lot like Mega Man 3 in that it's mostly trying to feel like Mega Man 4 and 5 on NES, and let me tell you, it does a heck of a lot better than Mega Man Game Gear that attempted the same thing. Really strange that it would come out 2 years after this game. Basically, what I'm trying to get at is Mega Man Game Gear is worthless. The graphics and music of Rockman World 4 are pretty spot on, and the Robot Master levels are familiar. Not to say this game doesn't have completely unique content as well, since it sure does. All of the Rockman World Game Boy games do, but I feel that it did just as good a job as Mega Man 3 when it came to replicating the NES games. When it does start to do its own thing though, expect to die, but it really feels like I'm the only one that found this to be the hardest of the Rockman World games. There's just stuff that'll jump out at you, and the enemies feel like they got really high damage output this time around, to where you can die in like 3 hits sometimes. A lot of the unique level design I can't really say I care for. I don't find this to be fun at all. It's not really all that difficult, just boring. And just take a look at this hippo guy that used to be a complete joke. He's turned into quite the formidable foe. Look how many more blocks there are to shoot and how little space there is to actually avoid his attacks. Not that I think the hippo guy is actually one of the hard parts of this game. A tiny thing that bugs me is that the charge shot actually pushes you backwards. It would not surprise me if I underutilized the Robot Master weapons though, so if you use them properly it might make this game a whole lot easier. Looking back at the footage of my playthrough, I admittedly underused them for the levels themselves, which would have likely made some sections easier. I will say something I forgot I disliked about this game is the Wily letters you have to collect, which I think is just silly. You shouldn't be required to find collectibles just to enter the Wily stages even after you've defeated all the Robot Masters. If you missed one, you gotta go back and search for it in the levels, which there are alternate paths which I also don't care for. I'm just really glad these letters are not a requirement in any other Mega Man game. But anyways, I was just looking for things to try and say to justify this being my least favorite of the Rockman World games, since this is frequently brought up as being potentially the best of all 5. It's entirely possible I would change my opinion after second or third playthrough, I just don't really have the desire to, especially when I can just play Mega Man 4, which is potentially my favorite of all the games. I'm not even trying to claim that this is the weakest of the Rockman World games. It probably is Rockman World 2, but for me Mega Man 4 was the one I had the least fun with, but it's no doubt still a solid game and for sure one of the top highlights of the Game Boy library. It's still a well-made Mega Man game. And now I get to talk about my favorite game in this video, which is Rockman World 5 or Mega Man V, and now I can show you my overall personal standings of these games. And this is the one Mega Man game that is consistently brought up when discussing the best original Game Boy games, and I completely agree. It costs at least a few dollars. White people. Or you could just buy the Japanese version, and I'm not sure why you wouldn't. But anyway, they basically realized all they had to go off for the next Mega Man game on Game Boy was Mega Man 6, whereas all the other games combined 2 titles. So instead of simply making Mega Man 6 for Game Boy, which would have been pretty lame admittedly, they decided to create an entirely original game, and I think this game is why Capcom had confidence they could handle an entirely original Mega Man game in the X series. This is just its own game, and I kinda wish all of the other Rockman World games were entirely original, since I'd be much more likely to revisit them over just playing the NES games, which I prefer. Instead of Robot Masters, you got Star Droids, all named after planets, and they don't appear in any other Mega Man games. And yeah, this whole game takes place in space as you go to different planets, which gives it quite a unique identity, but it can lead locations to feeling pretty samey, since you'll probably get tired of seeing space in the background. Although the levels themselves take place inside a base the vast majority of the time. Another difference is that Rockman now has the Mega Arm instead of a charge shot, which I'm not going to pretend I prefer, since it has worse range and you gotta wait for it to reattach, but I think this is a response to the criticism that the charge shot is overpowered. Though you can still hold the weapon on enemies for additional damage, which is pretty satisfying to do and a cool idea. This game though is just really well made. The levels are mostly all solid, and it's easily the lengthiest of the Rockman World games, as far as the amount of content. It doesn't really have any annoyances for me like Rockman World 4, and I really don't have complaints other than the same complaint I have with all of the other Mega Man Game Boy games, which is that it feels too slow, which is to be expected. I also don't really care for shops in Mega Man, or the shmup-inspired section, but for some reason Game Boy games in particular really love throwing in a somewhat lousy shmup section, and here we have Mega Man getting in on the action. But I can at least appreciate that they were just trying to make a cool and memorable entrance into the Wily stages. There's probably a lot of people that prefer this title over Mega Man 5 on NES, even though they're completely different games, so maybe I shouldn't even compare them. Well, I can't say I prefer it. It definitely does get close, as this title is certainly more ambitious and absolutely worth checking out if you like Mega Man. Certainly the best game in this video for me, and it does make me sad that we'll never get spin-offs like this for classic Mega Man ever again. I suppose the last and closest thing would have been Street Fighter X Mega Man, which by this point is 12 years ago, and that game is, I'm gonna assume this title didn't sell very well, which explains the high prices for North America. It was released quite late into the Game Boy lifespan, and they were releasing a whole lot of Mega Man titles by this point. If they started the Rockman World series with a completely original banger like this, instead of borrowing so much from the NES games, I think the spin-off series would have been more popular, and would have certainly helped justify people wanting to get the Game Boy games alongside the NES games. After Rockman World 5, we would not get another new Mega Man game in the Game Boy family until 5 years later in the form of Mega Man Xtreme on Game Boy Color. This gap in release can be explained since Game Boy was pretty much a dying system, but it got a second life thanks to Pokemon, and as a result the Game Boy Color came out. In between that time we would get some other handheld Mega Man games, Mega Man on Game Gear, Rockman and Forte on WonderSwan. I think I'm one of the only ones who actually likes this game, and Rockman Battle and Fighters, which is pretty neat. And this was actually the first handheld Mega Man to be developed by Capcom themselves, but with the Game Boy getting a second life, they would also go on to develop this game for Game Boy Color. Unfortunately, this game does go back to doing what the first 4 Rockman World games did, this time combining 2 console Mega Man X games. And yes, I would have preferred if they made this an entirely original game. The first time I cleared Mega Man Xtreme, I was pretty underwhelmed. Since it is a very short game containing only 4 bosses, then you get to the Sigma stages, which contain levels and bosses found in X1 and X2. After this you unlock hard mode, which as it turns out, is actually the second half of the game, containing the other 4 bosses, and you keep all the weapons you gain from normal mode, although the Sigma stages are the exact same in the end, which will probably be a little disappointing. After this you unlock Extreme mode, which is both normal and hard mode combined, which doesn't force you to watch all these stupid cutscenes featuring newly added characters, like this guy Midi. So whenever you're replaying this game, Extreme mode is the way to go. These unskippable cutscenes are no doubt my least favorite part of the game. Unskippable cutscenes like this have no place in a Mega Man game, especially when they're not even in the original games that this is based off of. When I replayed the game last without my original save file, these cutscenes were pretty much unbearable. Had I still had my save file, I could have just picked Extreme mode. Unfortunately, you have to unlock a mode that is just how the game should have been from the start. This game was, however, my introduction to Flame Stag, Wheel Gator, Magna Centipede, and Morph Moth, which was pretty cool at the time since I'd only played the first Mega Man X, which I should mention as of now is my favorite SNES game. So it's no surprise that Mega Man Xtreme is one of my absolute favorite Game Boy Color titles. My second favorite Super Nintendo game right now is Donkey Kong Country, which also has a Game Boy title that honestly I don't think was executed all that great, mostly due to the decreased screen size that kind of ruins the original level design. Mega Man Xtreme though is actually a very impressive 8-bit remake of the SNES title in my opinion, and definitely has its own charm with the Game Boy chiptune music that's worth listening to. While the controls here are good for the most part, if I remember correctly I felt there were times where my inputs didn't register during wall jumps. Maybe I'm just crazy, but let me know if you had any similar experiences with that. One big difference from the Rockman World games is that the screen is no longer fixed, and when they're scrolling it's limited to horizontal and not vertical, but the X games have plenty of vertical scrolling since X is capable of wall jumping, so the level design in this series ends up being pretty different from what you would see in the classic series. I'm only mentioning this because this can be a problem on Game Boy Color due to the screen size, and X himself is definitely bigger on the screen than what you'd see on Super Nintendo. But this didn't really end up being much of a problem with the first Xtreme game. The second one, on the other hand, we'll get to. Another huge difference I should mention is that Chill Penguin is now the hardest boss in the game for some reason. At least if you use the regular Buster. The good news is you don't actually have to choose his level first. Since you don't need the leg upgrade, they give you the dash right at the start of the game. A very good change which honestly fixes what was my biggest problem with Mega Man X. While I don't think Game Boy Color has the strongest library, this game is very comfortably in my top 5 for this system. Mega Man Xtreme would thankfully get a sequel, back when it was actually possible for Mega Man to get sequels, since they attempted to revive both classic Mega Man and the X series on PSP and were unsuccessful, which is actually very sad. This is actually the only game in the video that is playable only on Game Boy Color, since the first Xtreme game you can actually still play on the original Game Boy, even though the US box forgot to indicate this for some reason. Probably the best change in Xtreme 2 for me is that checkpoints no longer make you stop, which was a small annoyance in the first game. Unfortunately, the cutscenes are still unskippable on the first playthrough though, which I think is my biggest problem with the game. If you have to retry a level after game overing, you have to sit through the same cutscenes you've already seen, which is really stupid. I expect this from a Final Fantasy game on PS2, but a Mega Man game? Are you kidding me? Ridiculous. The game actually combines all 3 Mega Man X games, while pretty much every other Mega Man game on Game Boy combines only 2 console games. On paper, it's a better game than the first Xtreme game because, well, you can switch to Zero at any time by pressing select. That is, after clearing both the X mission and Zero mission, which are the 2 halves of the game featuring different levels and bosses. Although only the character that actually defeats the boss is given the power, so you gotta decide which power on who makes the most sense, which I think is kinda neat. Then you unlock the Xtreme mission, so yeah, basically like clearing the first game on normal and hard mode. But switching to Zero anytime is not even something you can do in Mega Man X3, so a lot of people really like this game for that reason. Again, I feel like Extreme mode should have just been the default mode from the start. It does seem like everyone seems to prefer this game over the first Xtreme, except for me apparently. Remember what I was saying about how these games have vertical scrolling while classic Mega Man doesn't, and this can create problems especially with the small screen? Well, it's not really that much of a problem in the first Xtreme game, but here, it's really annoying. So much instant death just because of blind jumps and not being able to know what's below you. You might not even be able to react to what's above you either until you get hit. This section that's not remotely challenging in X2 has been turned into the most dreadful part of the game due to the screen size and, to be honest, just bad design. Honestly, I don't even know what they were thinking with this. You can't see ahead of you, so basically you just have to memorize the layout. This doesn't even play like a Mega Man game and is quite frankly awful. And this is probably the single worst section out of all of the Mega Man games on Game Boy. And I didn't even mind it at all in X2, even though I don't really think it was a great attempt at adding gameplay variety. As much as I want to love this game, it honestly feels like the most carelessly designed of all the games in this video. And as a result, is my least favorite of all 7. Of course, I'm not counting Rockboard, since it's not even in the same genre, and I already said that's my least favorite game in the entire series, period. Since it sounds like I'm being overly negative about this title, I will say I still like this game and had fun with it, no doubt. I mean, it's easily a top 10 Game Boy Color game for me, especially if we're talking about exclusives. Although I wonder if there's anyone that would argue that these aren't exclusives. I mean, Nintendo just wanted to release as many games as possible in its small lifespan to justify owning one, and as a result, like 90% of the library is just Kusoge shovelware. But now we're getting off topic. Basically, I'm just a little sad that unlike Xtreme, this title never grew on me after 3 playthroughs. Playing through the game again to get to the final level and boss on Xtreme mode just didn't feel all that worthwhile. Pretty much every Mega Man game grows on me after multiple playthroughs. Mega Man X4 for example, I didn't love it the first time I played it. I mean, it was pretty different from the other X games, but the second time when I went through a Zero, it kinda clicked for me. That just didn't happen here. So these are my standings of these games ordered by how much I like them. As I said, I can confidently recommend all 7 of these games. They're simply must-plays for the Game Boy and Game Boy Color libraries. Mega Man is just easily one of the strongest series on Game Boy. Rockman World, on the other hand, thankfully the Famicom version sold 0 copies, resulting in the Game Boy version never making it to store shelves. Unfortunately, it seems that we won't be getting Mega Man spin-off games like the World or Xtreme series ever again, but the point of this channel is to look at the awesome games of the past that I still like to play, and think you should play as well. So if you want similar videos to this one where I cover various Game Boy games, and I have a ton planned, subscribe for more.